Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series. For early access to ad-free full-length episodes, you can find me at patreon.com/the Cult Vault. But for now, we continue with Gael. When you would feel yourself needing to be sick, or you had that familiar feeling that you were going to be sick, did you always know that again was the cycle was about to start
Yes.
again? Oh, that
It's
is
been like,
horrific, Gael.
yeah, it was awful. And I would vomit up the lining of my stomach. It was so bad. It's like a stomach migraine. So you get the prodrome, sort of that feeling that comes on beforehand. And you could feel this, it will start off with mild nausea and it would build and it would build and it would build. And then the vomiting would start. And as soon as I would go to my mother and say, the vomiting is starting, she would just groan and roll over in bed and leave me. And there were times when I'd be left alone, many times that I'd be left alone in the bed, alone in the house for the whole day with no one to care for me, no one to look after me, while my mother was working full time with the leader of the cult. She would be gone and she would be with him there doing the church work while I was vomiting my heart out and getting more and more dehydrated. So that was tough.
That's so horrible to think about. It's tough when kids are always poorly. And I know that when one of my children is being sick and there's nothing you can do for them but try and get them to eat and drink and wait for it to pass, it's so tough. And they have temperatures and they want to cuddle, but you can't cuddle them because they're too warm. That is really hard. So to think of you as a child that doesn't have any of that stuff is really. And then you think about all the other children that are experiencing medical neglect in that way. But it's not just medical neglect, it's emotional neglect, it's physical neglect. It's really, really like, and when you bring faith healing into it as opposed to traditional medicine, that is where I really struggle as well, being sympathetic to people who have really positive religious groups and experiences. It's that sort of thing that I really, oh, it's tough.
Yeah. Yeah, it was hard, but I think looking back, it was my normal. I used to cry out, and because you get a lot of pain in your stomach as well. And as I kept vomiting, as I said, I'd sometimes vomit up blood. It was just a really horrible thing. You would go into this cycle and you couldn't stop it.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, they'd hold out and hold out and hold out. And then finally, mum would step in and say she needs to go to hospital now. And so they would put me on really high doses of Stematol and Maxilin. And when that happened, what would happen, would get a severe allergic reaction, which would affect my brain. And my eyes would roll back in my head, and I would nearly swallow my tongue. So it was horrible. But one lovely thing that sticks out in my mind, and I'll never ever forget it, was in hospital. I was away from the church. I was away from all the demands. And even when I was getting sick, it was like, oh, I don't have to go to church.
I wondered about the respite. Women from the Children of God that talk about their experiences in why I think specifically I'm thinking of Mary Mahoney, where she would talk about having to have children and more children and more children, and those stays in hospital where you're given buttered toast after giving birth is like, oh my goodness.
And that's the thing. There was a special, I used to go into St. John of God Hospital in Ballarat, and that was a frequent thing. Between the age of about 8 and 16, I was nearly in hospital every month. So that's how severe it was. And there was a beautiful nun. She was in charge of the children's ward. Her name was Sister Cadgerton. I remember her well. And she used to fuss over me. It was like the Queen of England was arriving, and she would take full charge of me. The nurses hated her because she was quite a bitch to them, but she was an angel to me. And she was the mother figure that I really, really craved. Yeah.
Well, we said that there wasn't any intervention, but maybe in some ways there was a little bit in terms of support from this individual. Maybe she recognized that there was something, not quite adding up with your
Yeah,
home
she
life.
was just beautiful. She would be at my bedside. She would make sure that I had all my needs met. And it was years later, once I grew out of this condition, and that's what often happens with this. Look up cyclic vomiting syndrome, and there's an organisation out there now that supports these people who have it. I'm well, and I've been well since I was 20. But I returned from Perth. I was living in Perth, and that's where we were made to go. I came back to Victoria about age 19. I hadn't seen Sister Cadgeton and my doctor for a number of years, since about 16, so about 4 years. And I went in to see the specialist and said, I'm well now. I've gotten over this awful condition. He was just so delighted, and he said, I'm going to send you straight up to the hospital to meet Sister Cadgeton. And he rang up, he said, I've got someone who wants to see you. And I drove up to the hospital. There she was, standing out the front, waiting for me. And her arms went around me. And it was just, it was just a moment in time I'll never forget.
I have this vision in my head that she's an Irish woman, but I imagine she probably wasn't. She is.
She was. She was Irish, and she used to write me letters when we moved to Perth about this spiritual renewal that she had, because back in the 70s, the Catholic Church was getting influenced by Pentecostalism. And so she broke into that. She said she had a closer walk with God since then. Eventually, she went back to Ireland, but she was an angel that I believe was sent to me in those years of darkness and isolation that made me feel safe, I suppose. Yeah.
I can't do a very good Irish accent, but I imagine she'd be like, oh, Gael, it's young Gael again. Look at you, come here. Like
yes, that was her. She was amazing. And while I don't support Catholicism as such, she was an angel to me, and I'll never, ever forget her. Yeah.
So I think there's a few things to go back over. What age were you when you had your first children?
I was 32 when I had my first child. That's Bettina. And I was 35 when I had my son Matthew, and 37 when I had my daughter Emma. So I had 3 children very close together, and they're all doing wonderful things in their lives right now. And I've been telling them about your podcast, and they're really keen to hear the interview.
Oh, that's awesome. What was your pregnancy sickness like? This is just for my own curiosity, really.
Well, when I was pregnant with Matt, that was the worst one. Some of the vomiting came back in the first trimester. I had to be admitted into hospital. Every now and again, when I'm under stress or a virus hits me, I can have an episode of vomiting, but it's not like what it was when I'll vomit once or twice, and that's it. It was not like that, like as severe as when I was a child. So with Matthew, I developed gestational diabetes with Matt, but that disappeared when he was born. And normal pregnancies, all normal pregnancies.
Gosh, I'd be just like if that feeling of you're going to be sick. It's stressful.
Hardly vomited though. See, that's the thing. Hardly vomited during any of the pregnancies apart from that. So I sailed through it, and normal births, no emergency Caesars or anything like that, and no pain relief on my last birth with Emma. So
You'd done your share of being sick up to that point already, so
yeah, for sure. And I'm pretty well now. I don't ever sort of go back into those cycles. But I
good.
believe a lot of it, I sought a lot of counselling around that. And I believe a lot of it was due to the stress that we were under. There was a lot of hellfire and damnation kind of preaching. William Branham and I recall as a child, we were made to watch a film to watch William Branham cast out a demon out of this woman. I was about 8 at the time, and I remember going home and feeling absolutely terrified to go to sleep and needed to be near people. And that stayed with me for years and years and years. So the trauma of having to watch all of that, and, we were heavily influenced by that man back then.
You talk about the mother of the other family having a type of schizophrenia where there are episodes she's experiencing. But if you teach a child a different reality from the moment they're born to the reality that actually exists in the world, I don't know how you can differentiate between somebody with schizophrenia and a child brought up with actual doomsday prophecies that are never going to come true.
Good point. That is a good point, because people with schizophrenia have this, oftentimes they think they're a prophet of God or something like that. The end of the world is coming. You don't trust authorities. In fact, we had a tragedy here in central Queensland. You may have seen it over on your news in the UK, where 2 brothers and a wife of one of the brothers, they grew up in the Baptist church, but the father broke away from the Baptist church, and they believed Christ was returning, and they were preparing for the end of the world, and became very paranoid and shot dead 2 police officers. They lured the police officers to their property and shot them dead. So there are lots of similarities between that and what we grew up to believe. That's a good point. That is a really good point.
I mean, I wouldn't be able to unpack the nuances of it or even talk about it from a scientific thought standpoint because I'm not qualified, but I'm just thinking about kind of having a foot in 2 different realities and then having to work out which one is true and which one is the manifestation of either ill mental health or somebody else's teachings. I imagine there has to be a similar process there in terms of therapy, oftentimes medication. So it's just an interesting parallel. Maybe we'll have to get somebody on the show to talk to us about it from a trained perspective instead of me sitting here armchair diagnosing, which I really tell myself off for doing. So I apologize, listeners.
That's the thing. Even as a child, you see the difference is, even as a child, I was talking to my son Matt today about this as I was preparing for this interview. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance going on, and you have to believe your gut. That's what I believe. And even as a child, listening to some of those Bible stories, particularly in the Old Testament, and I can bring out an example of, I think it was Abraham sacrificing his son on the altar, and God said, you need to trust me, you need to do this, and he was about to plunge the knife into his chest, and then God provided the sacrifice, which was the lamb. And you think to him, I as a child would think about this and think, that's not right, that's so cruel to make, God is supposed to be a God of love, but in this story, he's not a loving God.
No, and that makes me think of the People's Temple and Jim Jones doing white knight tests with members of the People's Temple, where I suppose members of Jonestown at this point, where he would do a drill where they had to act out their mass suicide, and he would tell people to drink laced drinks just to test their loyalty. So this was happening months and months before the November 18th event took place. And he was testing people just to see if they would do what he said. And those white knight drills always make me think of that story in the Bible of God saying, you must do this. And then right at the last second says, I'm just making sure you would do what I was asking you to do, but you don't actually have to do it. At least not yet.
Yeah, that's a tactic they use, and making us children do certain things that we really didn't want to do, like preaching on street corners and being a laughing stock in the school ground because of it. These are the things that were forced upon us. And, when we reached a certain age as well, we were forced, to be baptized and forced to speak in tongues as well, as young children. It's something that I really didn't want to do. But you couldn't question it. You had to go along with it. So, yes, it's very tough.
When you mentioned that your uncle would preach from the pulpit and baptisms would take place and there would be certain services, where did these services take place in those earlier years before the move to Perth?
Well, we leased out a hall. Some of the services were held in the home. We leased out a hall where we would conduct our largest services to give others, like some of the community, the opportunity to attend, particularly those outreach Saturday nights. So that's, and there were lots of them. So, but as I said, yeah, we had to attend them all, and there were a lot of them. There was the Wednesday night prayer meeting. There was the all-day Sunday was taken up with Sunday morning service. There was a Sunday afternoon outreach on the streets and Sunday night service, Saturday night service. When we got to Perth, which is, that is a very horrific time in my life, the services were going every night, prayer meetings every night of the week. And that was a really tough time. I was there. We moved when I was 16, and we moved back in 1979. And it was horrific about what went on over there, because it became more and more extreme.
So at this point, you're not allowed to really form friendships or relationships outside of the group as a child. How many cousins do you have, and how many children are there in this other family?
So there were 4 children in this other family. There were 5 of us. I was one of 5. And in my uncle's family, there were 6 kids.
Wow. So there's more kids than adults.
Yes, definitely.
And it's not like they're tailoring sermons to suit children. It's still the same
not
adult.
At all. I would literally shake and tremble. Every sermon that came out of his mouth was frightening. He used to preach a lot about sins of the flesh. Now, looking back, I know why he did that. We live in a wicked world. There's, sex is evil. The sins of the flesh, you don't want to go down that pathway, you'll go to hell, sort of thing. And now looking back, I understand why he preached those sermons, because he was actually grooming my mother. And this is what I've noticed about some of the big time preachers of the day, like Jimmy Swaggart, for example. He used to preach a lot around the sins of the flesh. until he was found out, visiting prostitutes. And so the guilt that they have inside, it has to come out, and it comes out and they project their guilt onto their congregation. That's what happens.
So your uncle lives in the God house with his wife and 6 kids.
Yes, but not all at once. So they had some children. So there was large gaps between the ages. So his eldest son, David, he rebelled against his father at age 14, and he got lured back. He was invited to an AOG youth camp, and his father said, no, you're not going. They're evil. We don't want to have any association with them. And he went anyway. And what actually happened was his father disowned him, kicked him out of home. He was homeless at the age of 14, and he disassociated from him completely, became totally estranged from him for 20 plus years. Luckily, because Dad's family was a large family, and one of the relatives took David in and helped him to get on his feet. David went back into the Assemblies of God church, and he became a big name and an international preacher traveling the world, linking up with the likes of Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Baker and Tammy Baker, and all those big time evangelists, which I went on a tour with him back in the early 80s. And when I think about it now, the shame of it all. Yes.
It's interesting that he left at age 14 and would eventually go on to be an international preacher, almost like he left at a time where he could have a life, but also left at a time where he'd seen and learned enough from his own father to become charismatic and successful in his own preaching.
Yeah, he was well known in Australia and internationally. In fact, he was the representative for Jimmy Swaggart in Australia. He would bring out all Jimmy Swaggart's material. And when I travelled with him back in 1981, he was on Jimmy Swaggart's show. We visited all the big American evangelists and television programs like 100 Huntley Street up in Toronto, Canada. He was very well known. Yeah, but his father missed out on all of that, but David took on the mantle. But it was like father and son. They were so alike. Very strong personalities. Yeah, very narcissistic.
You mentioned that there was a point where your uncle began taking advantage of your mother, and you wrote in your writing to me that she was a vulnerable individual, and that's how he was able to take advantage and manipulate her in certain ways. So do you have any idea of when in the timeline this started to happen?
I don't know for sure, but having talked to my brother about this, I think it started not long after my parents married. So they were married in around not long after World War II, I think around 1948, I think. And back in those days, there was a lot of poverty around, people trying to get on their feet. My parents weren't well off, and they unfortunately moved in with my uncle and his wife. By that time, my uncle had already had David, and I think the other son was born. And so they lived with each other. And I think it started way back then. They were living under the same roof. They were sharing the same house. And I think my aunt and uncle had 2 children. My mum and dad had 2 children. And it started from then. Dad was recruited into the church and became the deacon of the church. And my mum became my uncle's personal secretary. So he pulled her right in, and it was very sort of incestuous almost. It was It was unhealthy. We saw each other every day. She did all the, the office work for the church, and one thing led to another.
When you talk about church work that your mum is doing, part of that then is that she's doing church work, but part of that is that there's an extramarital affair taking place between the two of them at this point.
Yes. And to this day, we really don't know the DNA. I had my DNA tested, and it came back that my dad was my biological father, but there was rumours going around amongst extended family members that I was my uncle's child, and I even believed that myself, but it wasn't true, and I heaved a sigh of relief, and that only came to light about 10 years ago.
I was going to ask the question, but I also didn't want to intrude, because in your writing, when you mentioned that there'd been this lengthy affair that took place and children in both families being born at different times and overlapping with the affair. And then I wondered, after you said that you have the traits and similarities that your father had, I wondered then if there'd been a chance for you to confirm your own DNA. Wow, what a wild conception that you grow up with brothers and sisters who could be half brothers and sisters.
Well, after my aunt passed away, my older cousin, David's younger brother, approached me at the funeral because they didn't know. They had no idea that this was going on under their noses, even as adults, until around 2005. I reacquainted myself with my cousins, and my auntie was still alive at that stage. They kept it all secret and hidden. And our family, my brother knew, my dad disclosed it, but they kept it secret. And that's another story in itself, how it came to light. And it was around a real tragedy that occurred. But I sort of reacquainted myself with my cousins, and I told them, I said, this is what happened. And they were shocked. They had no idea. And then when my aunt passed away a few years later, I was approached by my older cousin, and he said, we need to get your DNA tested just to see who you are. If you're our half sibling, then we'd be happy to accept you as a half sibling. But I'm really pleased to know that Dad was my real dad. I carry a lot of his traits. But I also suspect, just to carry on this story a little further, I also suspect that my older brother and my younger sister, there's question around their DNA. My older brother looks like my uncle. He has similar sort of narcissistic traits, and so does my younger sister. But we've all suffered complex PTSD, and I think my younger sister developed a borderline personality disorder, which, came out more as she got older.
I think I'd have to know. I don't know that I could look in the mirror and be like, do you know what? I look more like my uncle than I do my dad. And I know that my mum and my uncle were having sex with one another. I don't know that I could go through life just being like, oh, it is what it is. My father brought me up, so he's my father. I mean, you can, of course, your father would still be your father if he was the man that was always your father. But biologically, I think I'd still need to have that answer questioned personally. Yeah.
Yes, of course. And that's what I wanted. So I was ruled out, but I think there are two of my sisters, one sister and one brother who looked nothing like the rest of us. So there's always that question there. And we'll never.
Yeah. But it's tough because the genes that your dad and uncle share come from their parents. So, it might be that your brother looks like your grandfather or your great grandfather. So again, you just, oh gosh,
it does your head in.
Yeah, I could have.
It does your head in. Yeah. So there was that really, unhealthy, as I said, unhealthy relationship amongst the three families, and there was a lot of spying on each other. There was a lot of deep-seated resentment. And then, of course, Mum was so distracted with what was going on, being the church secretary and feeling quite important that this powerful man singled her out. She really she was a willing participant to it. But I do believe that, due to her anxiety, her social anxiety, the possibility that she was on the spectrum, it made her very vulnerable, and so it was just, very confusing, actually.
So your uncle receives this prophecy and declares to everyone that all three families gonna uproot and move over to Perth. So talk us through this whole segment of your life. The why Perth? Is this going to be the place that protects you in the end times? And what happens once you arrive?
I just want to wind back a little bit, just leading up to what I suspect there were a number of reasons. I think it was Bible prophecy that he misinterpreted to make him go to Perth, which was like the ends of the earth for us. It's, 2,000 kilometres away. We're living in country Victoria, and how big, there's that desert, the Nullarbor, that you have to cross, and you feel like you're in another country when you're over there. And we knew no one. But in the lead up to that, some years prior to that, I think it was probably a year beforehand, his other son, not David, but his next son, started to question his father's teachings. And my older sister and one of the daughters from the other family, they were deconstructing, and they were, questioning the teachings and saying, this is not right. And I remember there was a lot of talk going on between my aunt and between my mother at this stage, saying, something's going to go down, something's really going to happen. And it was one Sunday morning where, my uncle, just before he got up to preach, my uncle came down from the pulpit and pointed his finger at my sister, who was sitting in the row behind me, and this her friend, who was part of this other family, and his son, who had his wife and his young children, pointed the finger and said, get out. And so he excommunicated them, and that day half the church disappeared. So we became even smaller. And I recall my sweet, loving father, who's always got a smile on his face, got extremely angry, and he verbally attacked his brother and said, how dare you do that? These are young people who are questioning things. And he walked out as well. So my father left with them. And I was left feeling bewildered, overwhelmed. What's going to happen now? Will we all sort of dissipate and go our own ways? What's going to happen? Dad went to the church that my sister and others went to, but my uncle interfered to the extent that he told Mum, because he was so influential over Mum, that they weren't to sleep together, that poor Dad caved in and came back because he wanted to save his family. So that was that. And a year later, that prophecy occurred. We are to go to Perth, that Christ was going to return around the early 80s, and we need to prepare ourselves. I really don't know why Perth was chosen, apart from he pulled a scripture out of the Bible that convinced him that Perth was going to be the location. But I also think he went because my dad and my uncle come from a large family where we are very well known in Ballarat. We've got a street named after us. We've got now a big estate named in the family name in country Victoria, and we were well known around the ridges there. So I think he knew his reputation was being destroyed by what he was doing to all of us, and the heat was on, and he wanted to pull us out and go somewhere where he could continue to control us. So I think there was one level of that. That's my belief. And another aspect of God had told him that that's where we're to go and prepare for the end of the world.
I wonder if there's also an element of the control that your uncle had over your father after your father decided to walk out was never quite the same, even when your father returned. So maybe moving away or further isolation, like a re-indoctrination process almost by moving to a new location. I wonder if that played a part in it.
Actually, I had not thought of that, but you may well be right there, because that was the first time I've ever seen my father stand up to him. And he was away. He went, he did not attend the church for months. And it was a really unsettling time, because I was around 15. My brother was 16, and the whole family was divided. So, it was very unsettling. We did not know what was going to happen. And poor Dad, he decided to return because he was caught between a rock and a hard place. If he stayed, the family would be completely torn apart, and he wanted to keep his family together. That's all he craved. He loved us kids, and he wanted to protect us no matter what. So he did come back and then things worsened. And you're quite right. When we went to Perth, the indoctrination worsened. And we became a very small, there were still the 3 families, but it was much smaller than before, and the intensity really ramped up. So there were prayer meetings every night. We're doing a lot of street work. In fact, we were running into the children of God on the street and exchanging back in the day when they were out there doing their street work and being sexy for Christ, as they used to speak to me, and we would talk to the exclusive brethren over there and other exclusive groups, and we just didn't get the numbers in. And not long after that, my cousin, who I was close to in age, started to question her father, and this is where the tragedy really unfolded. So she and her younger sister started to question the father's teachings. I was still in there because I was nervous and anxious. My mother's anxiety was feeding onto me, and I had no outlet. I was working at that point outside the church, but my cousins were starting to question his teachings. Now, these 2 were very close to their father, and they dug in their heels and they left the church, which interestingly became a very dramatic series. Well, there was a lot of drama associated with what happened after that, and it caused us to return back to the eastern states, but we weren't going to go back to Ballarat. We ended up here in Queensland, where I still now live. So my cousin, who was close to me in age, we were all warned not to have anything to do with her or her sister. And so what actually happened was I started going to another church. They were ostracized, some of even the parents and the mother saying some pretty cruel things about their daughters. And at one point, was offered a job up in Queensland to come back to Queensland she was working in a bank, and they decided to leave, and they were going to travel by car across the Nullarbor to live in Queensland. And so on the Thursday night, my mother, who's so timid and shy sometimes, she sort of, this other personality comes out. She can toe the line until she gets pushed to a point. And she said, this is not right. We're treating these 2 lovely young girls we're treating them appallingly. This is not fair. They're going on Sunday. They're starting a new life. I'll invite them over for dinner. That was on the Thursday. On the Sunday, they were on the road. They had an accident. The car rolled on the Nullarbor. He was killed instantly and was left in the car with her deceased sister for 3 hours whilst waiting for the flying doctor service to come. It was the most horrendous thing. It was horrendous. Luckily, they were driving with a family and there was a nurse behind them, and the nurse was able to attend to but it was just traumatic because the words were spoken before they left on that trip that if they died, they were going straight to hell. It was just horrendous. And you can imagine how I felt when on the Sunday night I was sitting down eating my meal and the older sister came. I could hear her coming through the door, screaming. And the words were said, there's been an accident, is killed and is alive. And being with the family that night, and it looked like my uncle had had a stroke. He was just sitting sort of half dazed in his chair because all the lead up and the treatment of those poor girls, there was no reconciliation, nothing. And those words were spoken to her, if you die, you're going to hell. And then, of course, I was targeted. So it set me back years before I finally was able to leave. It was horrendous. I still have dreams of it.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series. To get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.